Rob to get us started. Rob?
Great. Thanks, Jasmine, and welcome those that have joined today. I know we've got a few faces or names there I don't recognize. Definitely some customers with us for many years, and also some newer customers like Kim. So, Kim, David, thanks for the chat. Appreciate your interaction on the side. If you have questions or commentaries that go along, you can throw it in the chat, throw it in the Q&A. I'll be paying attention there. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Rob. I'm the CEO of Intranet Connections. A couple decades of working in intranets, from working on one in-house, custom built for an organization to off the shelf like we do at Intranet Connections. So some diversity experience, recovering programmer, father 3, and getting into snow sports just recently, Jasmine, but a hockey player at heart. So that's my introduction. So I'll let Steve introduce himself here as well.
Hi everybody, I'm Steve Bynghall. As you might tell from my accent, I'm based in London, England. So it's the evening here, it's just after 8 o'clock. But really pleased to be here. And I'm basically an Intranet consultant. So I've been working in the space for sort of in and out of the space for around 25 to 30 years, starting with kind of knowledge management, and then I used to work for a large global accountancy firm doing intranets and sort of other kind of collaboration platform. And then for the last 13 or 14 years, I've been a kind of freelance consultant. So working with clients mainly on the kind of strategy and governance and helping them kind of content strategy, etc., helping companies to make their intranets better and more effective. And the other thing I also do is I do a lot of writing as well. So I kind of write about intranets. So, and one of the things I've been really pleased to do for the last couple of years is kind of partner with Intranet Connections and help work on some of their kind of like some of the ebooks and the worksheets that you can kind of download. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So really pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the background on your experience and the different things and skills you have. You've got a wealth of experience. So hoping to pick a little bit out of your brain and some of those stories and examples as you go through these 7 trends. It's nice. Of course, we're going to start with AI and get AI out of the way. As we talked about, it's the one that everyone wants to talk about, but maybe that's settling in. Maybe it's old news now, or maybe it's new news as all these Chinese models come out that are cheaper and looking to disrupt things. So I don't know. But we definitely have 6 other trends we're going to talk about, half which are not technology or tool related, which is exciting. So it's more about the people side. So we're going to basically hammer through these trends as we go through. The audience all filled in some challenges that are relevant that they're facing as they came in to register for this. So we're going to try and connect those into these trends. And if you have questions or you want to explore the questions that we're asking and discussions further, please chime in. So the first one is around AI. You know, for internal communicators, they're experimenting to find the right role for AI. That's the trend we're talking about. And, you know, I do internal communications as a leader, and everybody wears some kind of internal communications, produces content, needs to communicate something. So how are people using AI? And you know, some of the challenges is how is AI maybe creating generic, bland content, or how do we keep things on brand? And you know, some of these challenges, Steve. So maybe just talk a little bit about your experience over this last year as it's really exploded, maybe in the digital workplace.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, yeah, we, as Jasmine was saying, you know, we're all perhaps a little bit sick of hearing about AI, but it's kind of here, and I think it's impacting a lot of things, or potentially impacting a lot of things that we're all kind of doing. And I think, you know, for internal communicators, it's, you know, AI is perhaps it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, there's the potential there for, you know, to use AI in ways that will potentially speed up a lot of processes and you know increase the output and productivity, etc. But at the same time, it kind of, I think it's sort of perhaps it feels like it undermines kind of what what internal communicators do. You know, does it, as I said, does it kind of take away some of the control that people have, or internal communicators have, over, you know, implementing kind of best practice? Does it sort of suddenly produce these kind of reams of content that's off brand and not, you know, doesn't have a great deal of purpose? and also at one end, is it a kind of threat to sort of people's kind of roles? So I think there's a lot of kind of questions about it, and when it was interesting. I went to an internal comms conference in London. I think I found a sort of that mixture of kind of apprehension and excitement very much in that in the sort of in the mix of things. And I think my kind of feeling, and I think it's in common with a lot of how other kind of business functions are kind of using AI, so it's still kind of experimenting with it, I think, and that's on different levels. So I think that's on the kind of personal level. Everyone finds using AI is probably good for some things and less for others. So, for example, I do a lot of writing, and I've experimented with using AI for generating kind of text, and I find it really jarring. I end up rewriting all the text. At the same time, I've kind of found it useful for perhaps researching a theme or suggesting kind of topics. And I think when I've certainly spoken to clients who with internal comms functions and teams, that tends to be where they've been using AI most successfully, kind of at the beginning of like a content creation, as a kind of sort of starting point, and then then they're kind of like doing the copy or working to a kind of template, or or getting the messaging right, and then sometimes a little bit at the end to maybe just polish things off in terms of clean it up for spelling, etc., in a kind of cleaner way. So I think that's a very sort of personal. At the moment, it's sort of quite a personal thing, and I think also I'm finding that to kind of get your kind of head around AI, or using ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot, you sort of have to kind of spend some time to actually kind of get to know it, because I've also found that sometimes the prompts you put in, the instructions you give give the AI can really kind of impact the success you're going to have. So you have to kind of try to do a bit of kind of trial and error. So I still think we're on that. A lot of us are on that kind of on that sort of journey.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discovery still happening, right? I mean, everybody has in some way maybe tried some things, maybe either personally at home or different ways with these tools, or at work. But there's the discovery, learning how to interact with it. What can it do? What things does it bring productivity, or how does it help with creativity? As you mentioned, sometimes if you're a writer or creator, you're staring at a blank page just to get ideas or research started to spawn off and then create yourself. There's a lot of interesting. So as the audience is listening in here, if there's some tasks you're doing or you've experimented with, maybe just mention them in the chat. What's something you've done? Do you use it to draft an email? Have you used it to draft a communication, an announcement? Have you used it for what purposes have you used it for? I'm curious if people want to share on the side. One question I have, Steve, is just the maturity aspect of it. There's tools out there like ServiceNow, Accenture have maturity indexes to AI or AI adoption or readiness of organizations. How do you see this being rolled out in the businesses that you've been working with? Do they have some kinds of policy or guidance around it, or that sort of thing?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's a whole kind of, well, it's almost like an industry building up around this idea of sort of AI readiness, basically. So you can't really, and that takes in lots of forms. So AI still has a lot of risks kind of associated with it in terms of the
Data privacy.
Data privacy, or and all that. Some of those are kind of being or some of those are being kind of ironed out through the services, etc. But I think there's also there's what's a lot of, certainly the larger corporates are doing, is they're sort of starting with a sort of ethical kind of, they're starting with at the highest level with an ethical framework to kind of provide some sort of strategic guardrails, I guess, about what you
Right.
can kind of do with AI. Then on a more practical level, then organizations are trying to they're kind of doing a series of kind of guided, what I would call sort of guided experiments or kind of use cases, where they're trying to ascertain what the what the real value is gonna be before they kind of spend a lot of money on rolling out kind of licenses for everyone, because AI is kind of expensive. And also
For sure. Yeah.
the problem is it's still changing so much, not only with the products, but obviously, with what's happened with with the new Chinese AI that's come in. It's the whole thing could kind of change. So people are holding off, kind of making investments. But when they're doing these sort of large sort of experiments, they're also then putting in a lot of I guess change programs, where they're sort of uh, trying to increase employee awareness of about AI, and learning. And I think it was Accenture sent everyone to the kind of AI university or something like that. They had their own sort of, that's how they badged it. So there's a lot of user education and user kind of guidelines. So they kind of structured in the same way that I guess you know big 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 technology changes tend to kind of be rolled out. But I
Yeah,
don't think,
absolutely.
not that level of formality probably in sort of smaller organizations at the moment, I don't think.
Okay, I'm going to move us to the next trend just for the sake of time, because we have 7, and I know we could talk. And AI has been
Yeah.
a main trend for over a year here for sure, and definitely started before that. But let's skip to the second trend, which is around being the strategic advisor, and how that's being more essential to organizational success. Can you talk a little bit about that trend?
Yeah, sure. So I think probably most internal comms professionals will have varying degrees of or varying experiences of how well appreciated they are. So sometimes, in internal comms, even though it's a critically important, sometimes it's not. In some cases, I think IC teams have tended to be regarded as people who maybe they are, the people who just draft messages, or people who just put things up onto the intranet, etc., rather than actually playing that kind of essential strategic kind of role, particularly kind
Right.
of to
Instead of just
to
disseminating
leaders.
content and or taking orders, those kinds of things, right? I mean, a lot of our audience and a number of our customers, they don't even have dedicated internal comms teams or a specialist. It's maybe a fractional role, somebody in marketing, HR, those kinds of things. So in those, depending on these different situations, what are some things they can do with limited resources to be more strategic?
Um, yeah, I think this is around kind of trying to make kind of smaller steps and trying to be kind of proactive in potentially helping certainly leaders and kind of managers take a kind of more strategic view of their own kind of communications, because often leaders, communications is an extremely important part of leadership, but some leaders, and certainly kind of senior managers, aren't necessarily naturally confident communicators. So they often need a kind of bit of advice, a bit of coaching or advice, etc. So I think, if you have a kind of if an internal communicator, or someone who's got internal IC kind of responsibilities, if they can kind of be proactive and kind of support the leadership in perhaps coaching them to feel more confident in using kind of particularly digital channels, but also then looking to how they might plan a kind of a campaign or a difficult kind of change. That's where I think perhaps some leaders aren't aware that they need that advice. So I think kind of being proactive is the sort of way to go there, and trying to trying to establish a precedent. I think it's also trying to transition to a more kind of strategic role is also about establishing what you're not going to do, and and kind of saying no to perhaps some of those lower kind of level requests where in fact, because most digital channels, like particularly intranets, are set up so actually that there's a lot of people can actually contribute, and actually the internal comms person is there to facilitate rather than necessarily being doing all the kind of lower level work, I guess.
Yeah, I imagine a big part, and maybe you can touch on this too, is just, being so stuck in a lot of the execution aspects. How can they leverage some of these channels, these tools to pull data into the conversation to get, current state, desired state, report back on the communications and support that leadership strategically and what's working, how it's working. What do you see people doing there? Is there some examples, or how are people doing that? Support decision making.
In terms of the reporting, well, I suppose reportings can be quite tricky. I'd say most in terms of when you look at kind of like metrics and analytics, so you can show the kind of impact of things. It's compared when intranets and internal comms and internal digital channels tend to be less mature than say the analytics suites for kind of external facing websites and kind of marketing. So I think it can be kind of harder to kind of show the sort of impact. So I think when I think there can be more kind of like qualitative reporting, people telling kind of stories and of the impact of kind of internal comms to show, I suppose an example might be if you're a kind of leader and you're advising a leader on making a particular type of kind of communication and changing their style to have a kind of particular kind of impact. I think when they experience some of those kind of touch points for themselves and hear perhaps stories about how awareness has kind of changed behaviors rather than necessarily just showing there's a 3% increase in the annual employee survey. I think that's where that kind of has more sort of impact and resonance. Like I kind of guess
I like that.
Maybe
I guess you're touching on a balance of the qualitative feedback and the anecdotes, the stories on the ground versus just the numbers. That's fantastic. I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's go to trend number 3, which is going to be talking a little bit more about how to better serve frontline workforce. So those working directly with customers, directly on product, directly on services, those sorts of things. What are some of the roadblocks or challenges you're seeing or gaps in the industry?
I mean, I think this is an area where there's been quite a lot of movement over the last kind of few years. So I think it's tended to get better. But essentially, and actually, we're working on a kind of workbook specifically about this topic that should be kind of out in a few weeks. But a lot of the roadblocks that exist with the frontline, with communicating with the frontline workforce is principally because they don't necessarily always have easy access to a kind of desk during the day. So a lot of it is quite sort of the logistics, because they're either on site, they're outside, or they're on the go, or they're in front of customers. So it's difficult for them to access communication. So it's far less straightforward than say someone sitting at a desk. There's a whole load of other reasons as well. So sometimes not all. I think it's less in the case of perhaps in sort of somewhere like financial services, where most customer facing staff may have like digital identities, but certainly in some industries, a lot of frontline staff are not always kind of connected. They don't have a login to access kind of like the intranet or other kind of core digital channels. Sometimes workers can be outsourced, so they could, or there might be contractual reasons why they can't access those channels. So there's a whole stack of kind of logistical reasons. Also, historically, I think there's always been a bit of this sort of digital divide in terms of internal communicators have tended to be more aware of the needs of of kind of knowledge desk bound workers. Probably less so in the case of where I said somewhere like kind of financial services, but certainly in the kind of manufacturing, for example, I've spoken to lots of IC functions who don't really have much of an idea of what actually the people who work in those factories or industrial plants kind of do. So they tend to be, I think they tend to be less confident about kind of trying to communicate with those
Yeah, like a lot of this,
people.
as you mentioned, will relate to the industry that our audience is in, right? And that's one thing to consider as we go through these 7 trends. Which ones are most relevant for your organization? We do have customers that are people in the audience here that are in manufacturing, that have factory workers that maybe they have a digital display in the lunchroom,
Yeah.
and that's part of a channel. Or so I think a lot of this channels is a thing that stands out to me, and accessibility, as you've been talking in this trend, and what are relevant for front lines, given the nature of the industry that the business is functioning in. Is
And
that fair, or would you extend
yeah,
on that?
it is, but I think it's sort, yeah, and so there's, and there's lots of things you can do, particularly kind of around mobile access, around adding, a lot of apps or some kind of services. Also, some intranets also provide the ability to add additional workers who don't necessarily have Microsoft IDs, for example.
Yeah, we have healthcare workers with anonymous access, or they float around on kiosks and those kinds of things. So
Yeah,
some flexibility and accessibility
yeah.
aspect, as you mentioned, right?
I think there is, but I think a lot of this is about being kind of intentional as well from the IC function to want to kind of bridge that digital divide. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen that a
Yeah,
lot where people want to kind of play catch up, because like basically 80% of the world's workforce is probably can be considered as frontline workers. So it's sort of, most organizations are reliant on them, but I still think there's still a little disconnect there between
yeah.
the digital services they get.
One point you made was around licensing, right? Like licensing costs. Probably generally speaking, people on the front lines are, on average, their compensation is lower, and so the cost factor of tools for communications, maybe there's lower budget for that, or budget is almost non-existent. They're using personal tools, even with a personal email for communication. I've seen some customers doing that. So that's one thing that I think might be interesting is how do you see that as how licensing and costs for those digital tools factors into this gap or challenge?
What you mean, whether that's kind of
Well, do we
that's
buy
changing?
365 licenses for everybody in the
Yeah,
business, for instance, or
I mean, yeah, you can. I mean, Microsoft has some kind of, licenses, but essentially, it can end up being quite a significant kind of cost. So there's
right?
uh, um, so I think some organizations will go for a more special, kind of more specialist solution that's probably more targeted at kind of
Makes
frontline
sense.
employees. Um, it depends on but we're in kind of quite sometimes pretty particularly in some industries, it's quite challenging economic conditions. So it's not
Yeah,
that's not necessarily going to be forthcoming. And I think that's having said that, I think the pandemic, there was tend to be quite a lot more focus on getting digital communications for everyone. So I think
right.
that sort of did force more services that were perhaps more affordable for
Yeah, you can
the
see how the
frontline stuff.
connection, as you mentioned, of COVID helped really probably push this trend a lot to the forefront. Let's shift to the next one. So let's hop over to trend number 4, which is around personalization. So, addressing the needs and serving, the relevant needs of distributed workforces, geographically dispersed workforces. We have more generations in the workforce now than ever. the different needs from communication styles and channel preferences to ways of communicating, these kinds of things. How's this trend coming to the forefront, and what are you seeing as some ways that the industry is grappling with it?
Well, I think, yeah. So first of all, I think there's probably a general expectation, that we see in the consumer world where, people expect to have a more personalized experience. So, in the kind of apps and the sites that we might visit, there's usually kind of some more personalization options, and some people expect a site to kind of know them and kind of save their kind of preferences, particularly I think on mobile. And I think that's sort of over the last few years that's kind of come a little bit into play inside businesses and organizations as well. I think secondly, you've got just every workforce is just incredibly diverse. So there's a lot of there's so many different locations, roles, people of different tenure, people with different kind of backgrounds, etc. So there's and there's a kind of stack of different kind of different communication needs. So certainly within kind of intranet products and some other of the other kind of digital channels, there's been more opportunities to kind of drive kind of personalized experiences and use targeting to certainly to send messages or to drive news and experiences and relevant content based on someone's kind of profile data to reflect their perhaps where they're located, or if they're a manager or not manager, for example. And then also, increasingly, I think there's some of the products allow people to select their kind of preferences in terms of perhaps the kind of topics they'd like to hear about, or or choose their language, for example, that they want to see have their content translated into, or even how they receive their kind of notifications, etc. So, and I think with that diversity within the workforce, and that desire for, or where the expectation around personalization and the kind of evolution of products, I think that's where that's the sort of direction it's kind of moving. Having said that, I think personalization is quite challenging because it can be time consuming. So if you're an internal comms team of one, you're not necessarily going to be able to meet all the needs, and there's lots of dependencies, like having the kind of data in a reasonable shape, for example.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot in here, right? You're talking about language, you're talking about geography and time zones and interests and different generational aspects. There's so many things that it makes it hard for, with limited resources, to try to serve all needs down to the needs of one, right?
Yeah.
And so it was interesting when we talked some weeks ago about coming back to AI, because that was at the beginning, but one practical place that's being used is in language translation that you've seen quite effectively, and other ways that you can bring some productivity to still address this trend with one of the other trends that we're touching on earlier.
Yeah, and kind of auto translation sort of gets better, and I think people kind of accept it more. So there are sort of things you can kind of do, and it'll be interesting to see how AI does influence, certainly the ability to kind of target more content to different audiences, or come in with the kind of suggestions of this, saying, this might be of interest to you, or even start to preempt what people want, kind of reminders and things they want to kind of see.
One thing I wonder in here too, Steve, is the regulatory environment that organizations might operate within, that almost financially force people to pay attention to this trend or have to do things, right? So maybe, for instance, in Canada and Quebec, we have customers that have operations in Quebec, and having language localization to French and to Intranet is becoming important for them, or for other reasons like that. So I'm just curious, do you see that as also a thing where it's regulatory pressures or accessibility in government is another one I can think about, where the, tools and internal communications approaches need to meet these requirements?
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot of things in there. Certainly, certainly accessibility has been sort of up. It's been, I think there's more awareness of it now than 2 or 3 years ago, and certainly, even 3 or 4 years ago, and it's something that was always a little bit, I think, treated as a kind of given lip service to, basically, and so and obviously there's kind of legal requirements, see there's various US acts, and particularly for kind of government, federal institutions, etc.
Right.
So it is kind of important. I think I probably come with a slightly kind of European view of this, where I think there's a lot more kind of, certainly there's a lot more legislation, and speculative kind of lawsuits in the US based on this, rather than certainly on accessibility, rather than here in the kind of UK. So it's a difficult one, because I see a lot of people say they are compliant with the WCAG 2.2
Right.
requirements, but in reality, and usually something launches it is, but in reality, the content that people add often isn't. So
Right.
every single
there's some aspect of the system or the tools and versus the content and what's being put in or how it's being managed, right? And there's some balance there.
Yeah. But going back to that kind of personalization, I mean, I think there are elements, certainly personalization, where you can, where you are able to, change some of the settings to your needs, like around fonts and light and dark mode, etc. So I think that's the kind of way, that's the way it's going, and that should be people should be able to personalize their experiences. Also, things like notifications are quite interesting, in terms of, like, if I'm a frontline employee, I think I should be able to turn off notifications, so I don't receive any during my kind of working out of hours, for example, on my app, on my mobile app and stuff like that. So
I think what you're illustrating as we talk here is that there's a connection between these trends as well, right? And some overlap. And this one has quite a bit of, there are a lot of different contexts to it. So it's quite interesting. So let's jump to the next one. Let's go to number 5, which is around omni-channel. The days of just primarily being email being the main internal comms channel, intranets have emerged. You've got chat tools, and you've got video conference, these kinds of things. So what do we mean when we say omni-channel?
Well, yeah, omni-channel, I think it's one of those terms that can mean slightly different things to different people. But essentially, I see it as, as taking a kind of more kind of coordinated and integrated approach to using these kind of channels together to in ways where you're coordinating in communications and messaging to improve the impact, avoid kind of things like overload, and using a kind of more consistent approach, with kind of tone of voice, etc., and basically using kind of channels together kind of sensibly. So the classic thing is, making sure, if you have kind of email communications have lots of kind of disadvantages. They're kind of still here, but increasingly we've seen there's more coordination between intranet content and kind of email newsletters, for example. So that's an example of where there's a sort of more of an omni-channel approach. So I think when we talk about omni-channel, it sounds like it's sort of something that's all encompassing, and in reality, it tends to be, you know, people doing things in a more kind of coordinated way across these kind of different channels, and then by doing that, it's more in a kind of more strategic way as well, because there's just there are so many kind of tools. So often the emphasis is to try and kind of simplify that tool landscape, but I think there's also ways to try to use those different tools to their kind of advantages, to kind of reflect the different diverse composition of the workforce, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good
Right.
point, right? There's a lot of options at our disposal now, which is we're rich in options, and it's really how do we take stock of what are the pros and cons of each of these different channels, and which ones work effectively for which audiences, and what do we have a clear purpose for when we use one channel over another? These are all probably some important aspects, and to your point, being coordinated across these channels and cohesive in our message, in the brand or tone, these kinds are all things that touch on this trend. I can see some of the responses in the poll as, chaotic. We have way too many tools with no clear purpose. So just a shameless plug, we do have a lot of tools on our website to do some channel audits, channel purpose, and clarify these things. So you might want to look at some of those tools. Any other comments here? Steve, you want to share as we touch on
Well,
this trend?
certainly, I think, I think the thing is to just have if you have a kind of proper kind of channel matrix where where you're looking at, looking at content, message type, audience, and looking at and then how you use these kind of different channels for their, I think it's just about working out the detail and doing that optimally. The other thing to remember also is, in terms of this advisory role for internal communicators, is a lot of everyone can use these tools, so I think kind of users and leaders, they need help of the best way to use. There's a classic thing in intranets where people need to know what tool to use when. I think it's true of also in terms of more specific uh, communications needs. What communication tool should you be using, and for what purpose, and then what content format, etc.
Fantastic. And thanks, Jasmine, for sharing a link there and elaborating a little more, Steve. Let's hop to number 6. So we've got 2 more trends left for about 45 minutes in here. We got to get through here and leave some room for some questions. If people don't have questions, or if people have questions coming up, please, reminder, pop them in the Q&A. We'll bring any up at the end, or just pop them in the chat. We can address them as you put them in there. So number 6 is related to joined up approach to the employee experience. What do we mean by that, a joined up approach?
Right. So employee experience, again, it's one of those slightly kind of woolly terms that kind of means a lot to different things to different people, but effectively it's about I guess it's some people's define it as the kind of the sum of all the kind of touch points between an employer and an employee, and that's not just kind of everyday working, but also at particularly different moments that matter through the employee life cycle. So the kind of experience it has someone when they join a company, or when they get promoted, or how the company responds when they have a big life moment, like like starting a family, or getting married, or moving house, etc. So um, often, I think in the past, sometimes different business functions have kind of like just got on with how they got on with doing kind of what they need to do. So like an IT, because everyone, all business functions, even though employee experience sounds kind of like an HR type thing, actually, like all business functions, impact the daily life of the employee, and kind of what happens during these sort of more moments of kind of change. And I think internal communicators tend to have a role where they are sometimes because they speak to so many different kind of stakeholders. They're sometimes in the middle of these kind of these sort of experiences, talking about kind of change, and they own some of the channels that can actually help deliver a more joined up approach. So I'll give you an example. So employee onboarding, employee onboarding is a very involved process. So it obviously involves kind of communications. It involves HR having to do some kind of procedural things. It includes a lot of kind of risk related things. It includes a lot of IT functions. It includes the facilities, trying to giving someone a desk and sorting out their security pass and all that kind of stuff. And actually, for example, you can take an intranet and use that in a way that you can kind of streamline a lot of that process, um, give it a kind of more joined up approach where like an IT function can sort out some of their all the things they need to do, all the information they need to get from an employee to set them up. HR can get all the information they kind of need. IC can kind of drive some of the kind of communication goals that they want to, etc., etc., etc. And this is the example of how a kind of more joined up approach between all these kind of different business functions can drive kind of a sort of common employee experience. So rather than everyone going off in different directions, everyone's kind of focused on something that can actually make a place feel like a kind of great place to work, which makes all the difference in terms of talent retention and lots of other factors. And there's stacks of stuff out there, so, with showing the link between employee experience, better customer experience, profitability, etc. So
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, as you talked, I'm thinking about lots of things I've seen customers doing around like what you described, onboarding and coordinated efforts to do tasks, procedures, and those kinds of things through the onboarding. But beyond the onboarding, the ongoing experience for employees, and as you mentioned, in recognition, promotion, changes, all these kinds of things that have some touch with communications, whether that's through Intranet or other ways. A lot of that has been evolving over the years, which is great to see. Let's hop over to trend number 7. Great intranets. We're specifically going to talk about intranets in their role in supporting internal communications. But specifically, what are great intranets? What makes an intranet great? You've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing this for a long time. Rob, what, in your opinion, makes an intranet great?
What's make a great an intranet great? Okay, so in my view, an intranet tends to do 3 things. So it keeps people informed, keeps employees informed, it helps employees get things done, and it helps employees find things. Fundamentally, that's probably what it does. It does a load of other things, kind of like transactional kind of stuff, and then and then in turn it kind of helps achieve, drive productivity and efficiency and sort of engagement. So I suppose a great intranet will kind of do those 3 things: help employees get things done, keep them informed, and help them kind of find stuff. And often what makes a great intranet is ultimately the content. That's usually the most at the heart of it. So the content has to have kind of strong governance behind it. So the content is up to date, has kind of purpose, it's engaging, it's probably on brand. It's accurate. People kind of trust it. And then there's so that's probably for me at the heart of a great intranet, is something where you can, if you have an intranet where all the content is kind of up to date, that's and findable as well, that's probably like the single most difficult thing to do on
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
I
It's
think.
funny you mentioned that. It's also funny the way, like, the simplified thinking about what you're trying to accomplish with Intranet. I feel the same thing for internal comms. It's, you want people to know something, do something, or feel something. With your Intranet, the same thing. You want them to be able to get something and know something, or be informed, or be able to do something, do a task, as you mentioned, or be engaged or feel part of the culture or some sentiment of what's going on or changes, that sort of thing. So really interesting. As you mentioned, governance. David, who's on this session, he does a great job in governance. He's got hundreds of content. I've seen how he does it. But interesting thing, I've seen also where, I've done audits with customers where, their content currency is pretty poor. Content's not being reviewed. There's no clear archiving, reviews happening, these kinds of things. So it can be a really big pitfall, right? Which is the kind of the antithesis of great intranets is outdated content, because you're just going to abandon it, right?
Exactly. And that's the kind of start, when what tends to happen there is when people can't find things, that's usually when people can't find things, it's probably sometimes it's the search capability, but most of the time it's actually just to do with the content, because there's usually too much content and noise, or it's impossible to identify things from the titles, etc. So and then basically what happens is people see, well, no one's, the adoption starts to dwindle because people aren't getting the value. Then people, publishers don't keep their content up because they think, well, what's the point? Because actually what we're going to do is we're going to not use the intranet. We're going to build a SharePoint site over here and populate it with kind of stuff there. And then, or we're going to put it into Microsoft Teams or whatever. And then, then it starts to spiral because people sort of just don't trust the intranet. It's seen as not relevant anymore. So, and then, and then the other useful features, which is, often to do with, what to do with integrations or the ability to, or with Intranet Connections, for example, you just have a stack of great kind of apps on there that can do various different things. That sort of when value starts to kind of dwindle. So I think it has to start with, when you have a great successful intranet, has to start with content that's up to date and people can find and is useful because it helps them get things done and keeps them informed. Then everything else will fall into place.
I know in some of the challenges in our audience, we had people talk about internet design or redesign as a challenge. Is there anything that you're seeing there that's changing in how intranets are being designed or information presented? Any trends that relates to that?
I think there's generally been a trend towards kind of more brevity and on pages, and which I think is a kind of good thing, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. The internet design is kind of it's a bit wrapped up in sort of on what Microsoft dictates, to be honest, because there's still obviously a lot of intranets are kind of based on kind of SharePoint. There's also, in terms of, I think it's not necessarily designed, but I think people accessing intranets through Microsoft Teams, that's something that's certainly been kind of prevalent. So yeah, I'm not sure. I think I think there's definitely influence also from, consumer kind of sites and how those sort of appear, and maybe a bit more minimalist. I don't know.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm also curious just how we touched on the previous trend of personalization, if that's influencing the designs too. How much of the real estate gets controlled by the organization versus the end user, and that balance of control of the actual jobs you're doing.
Yeah, it varies really massively, I think, from kind of intranet to sort of intranet. You can see people put some pretty different things on their home pages, I think. But
for sure, it's amazing to see the diversity. Jasmine,
yeah.
I saw you pop on video. You're coming.
Yes.
We got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm popping on video just to give a 5-minute warning. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I think would be awesome if we could switch to Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to just raise up your hand, and I can come unmute you, or put them in the chat as well. I had a question. I thought this was really interesting here, but if you could summarize the 2025 internal comms challenges in one word, what would it be and why? I think this might be a little bit difficult one, but Steve, why don't you give it your best shot?
Oh gosh. What to know? Complicated, busy.
Complicated?
busy, I think. Bit busy, time consuming. I don't know. overwhelming? I'm not sure. I think everything's, I don't know. It's sort of difficult. It seems kind of challenging, but it also seems kind of doable at the same time. That's not one word, is it? I'm not doing very well. Not doing very well here. Rob, have you got a word for it?
Wow, yeah. I think it's just, yeah, this overwhelm was probably a good one, right? I think people are operating with a lot of limited resources, challenging so many different channels, so many different expectations for personalization, so much. I think it's just there's an overwhelm to this
Yeah.
function.
But I also think there's I do think there's an opportunity there, because I think
Oh, yeah.
I think I always felt I see teams, they're not often recognized, or I see roles or people who aren't necessarily in professional communicators, but are being thrust in that role. Sometimes the contributions they make don't get celebrated, but can actually kind of be really, really kind of significant. So they're kind of
They're too
like,
busy recognizing everybody else through the communications.
yeah, yeah.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, that's a really fair point.
Yeah. I love your comment in the chat, David. He says, I will say the IC team continues to build relevant, tangible resources that help us. So I think that's a great little comment that just adds to your point here, Steve. I would say focused, actually, because even though that might be a little bit different than what everybody else on the call is saying, but I think because there's so many different distractions happening right now, it seems like all the trends are kind of encouraging us to narrow down and focus on to like one specific thing, right? So that's what I think, but I'm not the expert. You
No,
guys are, right?
no,
I don't
or
see,
prioritization, I think is,
yeah,
it's probably,
Yeah.
prioritization.
yeah.
Yeah, those are good ones. I don't see any questions in the chat, but that's okay. If you want to find out more about Steve, you can connect with him here. I'll be sending this slide out with the recording that you guys can keep an eye out for tomorrow. You can check out Spark Trajectory. You can connect with him on LinkedIn. Steve, is there anything you would like to plug?
No, just connect with me and stuff. Actually, there is one thing I'd like to plug. So I do run a global intranet and digital workplace awards for an organization called Step 2, and it's going to be launching in February. And we celebrate global, or celebrate amazing intranets and digital workplaces. So if you think you're doing something special and you want to get some recognition, to kind of check it out, you can connect with me and I can give you give you details, and also it's totally free to enter as well. So
That is a great plug. And you've also plugged our upcoming workbook, which I didn't expect, but he spilled the beans, but that's okay. Frontline workers, that's what's going to be our workbook coming out in February, and most likely our webinar theme as well. So you guys get first glance, first access. I didn't even tell Rob yet, so he's finding out here too. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This was great. Steve, always great to chat with you and listen to your wealth of experience and knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us today, taking the time of your day, and we hope we'll see you soon.
yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's great to hear from you and see you, and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.